The morning of March 4, 1944, 32,000 feet above the North Sea, Captain James Howard advanced the throttles of his P-38 Lightning and watched the fuel gauges with practiced attention. Behind him, 173 other Lightnings formed a protective screen around 600 B-17 bombers heading east toward a target the Germans had promised would never be touched by American daylight raids. Berlin, the distance from their bases in England, was 432 miles. The round trip would consume nearly every drop of fuel in their tanks, pushing the P-38's range to its absolute limit. German intelligence had analyzed American fighter capabilities for 2 years and concluded such an escort mission was physically impossible. The math was simple. American fighters lacked the fuel capacity to reach Berlin and return. Therefore, bombers striking the German capital would do so without protection, exposed to the full weight of Luftwaffe interceptors who could attack without interference from escort fighters. The conclusion was repeated in briefings, written into tactical doctrine, and accepted as fundamental fact by every German fighter pilot preparing to defend the Reich. They were about to discover how catastrophically wrong they were. The intelligence failure had roots stretching back to August 1943, when Adolf Galland first warned Hermann Göring about P-38 Lightnings equipped with drop tanks appearing deep inside Germany. Göring had dismissed the reports as impossible, insisting damaged aircraft were gliding eastward rather than accepting that American fighters had extended their range dramatically. That dismissal had set a pattern. German intelligence continued analyzing American fighter capabilities based on assumptions rather than evidence, concluding that the tyranny of fuel consumption made deep penetration escorts impossible, regardless of what pilots reported seeing. The P-38 Lightning's development as a long-range escort had been neither planned nor straightforward. Lockheed designed the twin-engine fighter primarily for interception missions, prioritizing speed and firepower over range. The aircraft's twin Allison engines each consumed approximately 70 gallons of fuel per hour at normal cruise settings, with internal fuel capacity of 410 gallons in early models. The P-38's combat radius was limited to roughly 250 miles, sufficient for defensive operations, but inadequate for escorting bombers deep into German territory. The transformation began with external fuel tanks, drop tanks that could be jettisoned when empty or when combat required maximum performance. The concept was not revolutionary. Japanese Zero fighters had employed drop tanks since the attack on Pearl Harbor, extending their range to levels that surprised American defenders. But implementing drop tanks on American fighters required solving complex engineering problems related to fuel, flow, structural attachment, and aerodynamic interference. Lockheed engineers began experimenting with P-38 drop tanks in late 1942, testing configurations ranging from single centerline tanks to multiple wing-mounted installations. The optimal solution emerged as two 165-gallon tanks mounted beneath the wing's outboard of the engine nacelles. This configuration added 330 gallons of fuel without significantly degrading the aircraft's performance or handling characteristics. When fully loaded with internal fuel and external tanks, a P-38 carried 740 gallons, transforming its theoretical range from 500 miles to over 1,400 miles under ideal conditions. But theoretical range and combat radius were vastly different calculations. Combat operations required reserves for takeoff, climb to altitude, potential combat maneuvering, and safe return with fuel remaining. Weather could increase consumption. Navigation errors could waste fuel. Combat itself consumed fuel at rates that made peacetime calculations meaningless. The challenge was determining whether the P-38's extended range was sufficient, not just to reach distant targets, but to escort bombers throughout entire missions while maintaining enough fuel to fight, if necessary. The 8th Air Force began operational testing of long-range P-38 escorts in December 1943. The 55th Fighter Group, based at Nut Hampstead in England, received priority allocation of drop tank-equipped Lightnings and orders to evaluate their effectiveness on progressively deeper penetration missions. Initial results were promising, but revealed unexpected complications. Drop tanks occasionally failed to feed fuel properly, forcing pilots to jettison them early and abort missions. Aerodynamic effects from the tanks reduced maximum speed by approximately 15 miles per hour. Cold weather at high altitude sometimes caused fuel in the external tanks to gel, making it unusable. Lieutenant Colonel Jack Jenkins commanded the 55th Fighter Group's initial long-range trials. His mission reports documented meticulous attention to fuel management procedures that would become standard practice for all P-38 Escort operations. Pilots learned to climb to operational altitude using internal fuel, then switch to external tanks for the cruise phase, consuming the drop tank fuel before entering likely combat areas. This sequencing ensured that if combat required jettisoning the external tanks, sufficient internal fuel remained for fighting and return flight. The procedure was simple in theory, but demanded constant attention in practice. Fuel selector switches had to be monitored continuously. Gauges had to be checked against expected consumption rates. Any deviation from planned fuel burn required immediate assessment and potentially mission-critical decisions about whether to continue or turn back. German intelligence officers were aware that American fighters were using external fuel tanks by late 1943. Luftwaffe pilots reported seeing tanks jettisoned by P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings during combat. Crashed American fighters were examined, revealing mounting points for external tanks and documentation describing fuel capacity calculations. But German analysis consistently underestimated the tactical implications. Intelligence reports acknowledged that drop tanks extended American fighter range, but concluded the extension was marginal, perhaps 50 to 75 miles beyond normal radius. The possibility that properly configured P-38's could reach Berlin was dismissed as propaganda, designed to intimidate German defenders. This dismissal was reinforced by German fighter pilots' own experience with fuel limitations. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, backbone of the Luftwaffe fighter force, carried approximately 88 gallons of internal fuel, even with a single centerline drop tank adding 66 gallons. The 109's combat radius barely exceeded 200 miles. German pilots understood intimately how fuel consumption constrained operations. They projected their own limitations onto American aircraft, assuming similar constraints must apply. When intelligence reports suggested American fighters might escort bombers to Berlin, experienced German pilots responded with skepticism, bordering on contempt. They knew what fuel consumption meant. They knew the mathematics of range. American claims about long-range escorts must be exaggeration or deception. Major Heinz Baer commanded Jagdgeschwader 1 in early 1944. A skilled and experienced pilot with over 200 victories, Baer was responsible for defending northern Germany against American bomber raids. In briefings throughout January and February, he reviewed intelligence assessments that bomber formations striking targets in central and eastern Germany would be unescorted. American fighters lacked the range to penetrate that deep. Luftwaffe interceptors could position themselves beyond escort range and attack bombers without interference. The doctrine was clear and comforting. Wait for the escorts to turn back, then destroy the bombers systematically. The first cracks in this comfortable assumption appeared on January 11, 1944, when P-38 Lightnings escorted B-17 bombers to Brunswick, approximately 280 miles from English bases. German fighter commanders noted the extended range, but attributed it to favorable winds or exceptional fuel economy on that particular mission. Brunswick was deep, but not impossibly deep. The escorts were stretching their limits, but still operating within plausible range parameters. Then, on January 30th, P-38's reached Frankfurt, 310 miles from England. Luftwaffe pilots reported engaging American twin-engine fighters well beyond where any escort should have appeared. The engagement occurred at the target itself, not at the limit of escort range, where fighters would normally turn back. German intelligence scrambled to explain the discrepancy. Perhaps the reported P-38's were actually P-47 Thunderbolts, misidentified by pilots in the confusion of combat. Perhaps they were damaged aircraft that had somehow reached Frankfurt before running out of fuel. Perhaps the distance calculations were wrong. Any explanation was preferable to accepting that American fighters had genuinely escorted bombers 310 miles from their bases, fought over the target, and returned safely. Major Gunther Rahl, commanding Jagdgeschwader 11, reviewed the combat reports from Frankfurt with growing unease. His pilots were reliable observers who knew the difference between P-38's and P-47's. The Lightning's distinctive twin-boom configuration was unmistakable. If his pilots reported P-38's over Frankfurt, then P-38's had been over Frankfurt. But accepting that conclusion meant accepting that German intelligence's range calculations were fundamentally flawed. It meant accepting that the doctrine of waiting for escorts to turn back was becoming obsolete. It meant accepting that Luftwaffe fighters would have to engage American bombers throughout their entire mission profile, including over targets that were supposed to be beyond escort range. Rahl drafted a detailed report to Luftwaffe headquarters, outlining his concerns and requesting clarification on American fighter capabilities. The response came from Göring's staff, reiterating that American fighters could not reach central Germany in strength. Individual aircraft might occasionally appear at extended ranges due to favorable conditions, but systematic escort coverage of targets beyond 300 miles was impossible. Fighter groups should continue planning intercepts based on established doctrine. The escorts would turn back. The bombers would be vulnerable. Victory would follow. The February bombing campaign intensified German fighter pilots' confusion about American escort capabilities. On February 4th, P-38's escorted bombers to Frankfurt again. On February 6th, they reached Romilly-sur-Seine in France, then returned to escort bombers over southern Germany on February 8th. Each mission pushed slightly deeper than German intelligence predicted was possible. Each mission required Luftwaffe fighter groups to engage American escorts in areas where they expected to find only undefended bombers. The pattern created a crisis of confidence among German fighter commanders. Their intelligence assured them that long-range American escorts were impossible. Their pilots reported American escorts appearing at impossible ranges. Someone was wrong, and lives depended on knowing who. If intelligence was correct, then pilots were seeing things that weren't there, perhaps confusing altitude or distance or aircraft type in the stress of combat. If pilots were correct, then intelligence was dangerously mistaken, and tactical doctrine was based on false assumptions that would get men killed. Lieutenant Werner Schröer commanded a Staffel within Jagdgeschwader 27, operating from Wiesbaden. On February 20th, during Operation Argument, the massive six-day assault on German aircraft production facilities, Schröer led his unit to intercept American bombers approaching Leipzig. Intelligence briefings had assured him that Leipzig, 330 miles from England, was well beyond American escort range. His fighters would have clear shots at the bomber formations without interference. At 28,000 feet approaching the bomber stream, Schröer's wingman called out contacts at 3 o'clock high. P-38 Lightnings, at least 20 of them, positioning for attack from altitude advantage. The escorts weren't turning back. They weren't at the limit of their range. They were fresh, aggressive, and diving on Schröer's formation with every tactical advantage. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes. German fighters scattered under the initial diving attack, losing formation cohesion. Individual aircraft tried to reach the bombers, but escorting P-38's and P-47's engaged them before they could establish attack positions. Schröer's Staffel lost 3 aircraft without inflicting significant damage on the bomber formation. 1 pilot was killed. 2 were wounded. 0 bombers were confirmed destroyed. After landing at Wiesbaden, Schröer filed a combat report that directly contradicted intelligence assessments. American fighters were escorting bombers throughout the entire mission to Leipzig. They were not flying at maximum range limits. They had sufficient fuel for sustained combat operations over the target. The assumption that escorts would turn back before reaching central Germany was demonstrably false. His report joined dozens of similar accounts, flooding into Luftwaffe headquarters during the final days of February. Fighter pilots across Germany were reporting the same phenomenon. American escorts appearing at ranges intelligence insisted were impossible. Escorts with enough fuel to fight aggressively rather than conserving fuel for return flight. Escorts that stayed with bomber formations from England to target and back again. The volume of reports made dismissal increasingly difficult, but accepting them meant acknowledging that Luftwaffe intelligence had fundamentally misunderstood American fighter capabilities for months, possibly years. On March 3, 1944, Luftwaffe intelligence issued a revised assessment of American escort fighter capabilities based on accumulated combat reports and analysis of captured American equipment. The assessment acknowledged that P-38 Lightnings, equipped with external fuel tanks, possessed greater range than previously estimated. Escort missions to targets 300 to 350 miles from English bases were feasible under favorable conditions. However, the report concluded that missions beyond 400 miles remained impossible due to fuel consumption constraints that no external tank configuration could overcome. Berlin, at 432 miles from the nearest American bases in England, was beyond the P-38's maximum range. Bombers attacking the German capital would do so without fighter escort. The assessment was distributed to fighter groups throughout Germany on the evening of March 3rd. Pilots preparing for the next day's operations received briefings incorporating the updated intelligence. American bombers might strike Berlin. If they did, Luftwaffe fighters would intercept them without interference from escorts. The tactics were straightforward. Form up over designated assembly areas. Wait for the bombers to penetrate beyond escort range. Attack in strength once the escorts turned back. The mathematics were clear. The conclusion was certain. Berlin was safe from escorted daylight attack. 20 hours later, Captain James Howard crossed the German coast at 32,000 feet, leading a formation of P-38 Lightnings with full fuel tanks and orders to escort 600 B-17 bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The fuel calculations were precise to the point of being unforgiving. Total distance to target and return, 864 miles. Fuel consumption at normal cruise power, approximately 140 gallons per hour. Total fuel available with drop tanks, 740 gallons. Calculated endurance at cruise settings, approximately 5 hours and 15 minutes. Estimated mission duration, 5 hours and 10 minutes. The margin was measured in minutes rather than hours, but it was sufficient if everything went according to plan. The formation proceeded east across the North Sea, climbing to operational altitude. Each pilot monitored fuel consumption against planned rates, mentally calculating whether current burn matched expected performance. The external drop tanks fed cleanly, their fuel flowing into the engines without the freezing or flow interruption problems that had plagued earlier missions. Weather was clear with visibility extending to the horizon. Navigation was precise. The bombers maintained their planned course and speed. Everything was going according to plan. German radar stations detected the formation approximately 100 miles from the coast. Luftwaffe fighter groups across northern Germany received alert orders and began launching interceptors. The assembly point was designated near Brunswick, 280 miles from England, and 152 miles short of Berlin. Intelligence assessments indicated this was where American escorts would reach their maximum range and turn back, leaving the bombers vulnerable for the final approach to the target. Major Heinz Baer led 48 Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader 1 toward the assembly area, confident that within minutes he would be engaging unescorted American bombers. His formation reached 28,000 feet and began maneuvering into attack position, waiting for the bomber stream to appear without its protective screen of fighters. At precisely the moment when P-38's should have been turning back toward England, fuel exhausted and unable to continue, Baer's wingman called out contacts at 12 o'clock level. P-38 Lightnings, dozens of them, maintaining formation alongside the bomber stream with no indication of fuel concerns or imminent withdrawal. The escorts were still there, 152 miles deeper into Germany than intelligence had predicted was possible. Baer's tactical problem became immediately apparent. His fighters had positioned for attacks against unescorted bombers, but now faced bombers with full fighter protection. The P-38's held altitude advantage and positioned themselves between the German interceptors and their intended targets. Any attack run would have to penetrate through the escort screen, exposing German fighters to defensive fire while sacrificing the advantage of surprise. Baer made the decision that tactical doctrine required. Attack despite the escorts. His formations split into smaller groups, attempting to find gaps in the protective screen. Several Bf-109s managed to reach the bomber formation, firing brief bursts before P-38's forced them to break off. The engagement was chaotic and indecisive. German fighters succeeded in damaging several bombers, but couldn't press home sustained attacks while under constant pressure from escorts. After 15 minutes of inconclusive combat, Baer's fighters began running low on fuel themselves. They had climbed to altitude, maneuvered for position, engaged in high-speed combat, and consumed fuel at rates that now forced them to withdraw before the American formation reached Berlin. The irony was crushing. German fighters designed for defensive operations over their own territory were forced to break off combat due to fuel limitations, while American escorts continued deeper into Germany with sufficient fuel remaining to maintain their mission. The bomber stream continued east, with P-38 escorts maintaining protective coverage. At 200 miles from Berlin, then 150 miles, then 100 miles, German fighter commanders monitored the approaching formation with growing disbelief. The escorts were still there. They hadn't turned back at Brunswick. They weren't turning back at the limits where revised intelligence estimates predicted they would run out of fuel. They were continuing toward Berlin with every indication that they possessed sufficient fuel to complete the escort mission. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff commanded Jagdgeschwader 77, responsible for defending Berlin's airspace. As the American formation approached within 50 miles of the capital, he led his fighters to intercept, still half expecting the P-38's to turn back at any moment. They didn't. At 30 miles from Berlin, the escorts remained in position. At 20 miles, they were still there. At 10 miles, with the German capital visible on the horizon, American twin-engine fighters maintained their protective screen around the bomber formation that intelligence had promised would arrive alone and vulnerable. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound. Everything they had been told about American fighter capabilities was demonstrably wrong. The range calculations were wrong. The fuel consumption estimates were wrong. The tactical doctrine built on those estimates was wrong. They were engaging an enemy whose capabilities exceeded what their own intelligence services had told them was physically possible, and they were doing so without the tactical advantages they had been promised would be theirs. The defense of Berlin on March 4th was fierce but ultimately ineffective. Luftwaffe fighters attacked the bomber formation with determination, but constant pressure from P-38 escorts prevented sustained assault runs. German fighters would attempt to position for attack only to be engaged by lightnings before reaching firing range on the bombers. Some interceptors broke through the escort screen and damaged individual bombers, but the kind of concentrated mass attacks that had proven effective against unescorted formations were impossible when fighters had to fight their way through defensive screens, both coming and going. The bombers released their loads over Berlin's industrial districts, hitting war production facilities with acceptable accuracy, despite anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks. The damage was significant, but not catastrophic. What mattered more than the physical destruction was the psychological demonstration. American bombers had struck the German capital in daylight with full fighter escort throughout the entire mission. The one defensive advantage German fighter commanders had counted on, the certainty that deep penetration raids would be unescorted, had been proven false in the most emphatic way possible. The American formation turned west for the return flight, with P-38 escorts still in position. Fuel gauges showed consumption rates that matched pre-mission calculations. The drop tanks were empty and had been jettisoned during combat over Berlin, but internal fuel remained sufficient for the return flight to England. The mission profile that German intelligence had declared impossible had been executed with fuel to spare. Captain Howard's formation reached the English coast with approximately 45 minutes of fuel remaining, more than adequate for landing and recovery. Not a single P-38 was lost to fuel exhaustion. The escort mission had been completed exactly as planned, demonstrating that American fighters could reach Berlin for fight over the target and return safely with fuel reserves that allowed for contingencies. German intelligence analysts reviewing combat reports from March 4th faced an uncomfortable reckoning. Multiple fighter groups had reported P-38 escorts operating over Berlin. Radar tracks confirmed American fighters accompanying bomber formations throughout the entire mission profile. The conclusion was inescapable. American fighters possessed the range to escort bombers anywhere in Germany. No target was beyond the reach of daylight bombing with fighter protection. The defensive advantage that had sustained Luftwaffe tactics for 2 years had vanished in a single demonstration mission. Goering received the intelligence assessment on March 5th. According to witnesses, he initially rejected the report, insisting that the P-38's over Berlin must have been some kind of deception or misidentification. When presented with irrefutable evidence from multiple sources, he reportedly stated that if American fighters could reach Berlin, the war was lost. The admission was private and quickly retracted, but the underlying truth remained. German fighter forces had been planning defensive operations based on assumptions that were fundamentally false. American escort capabilities exceeded German estimates by margins that made existing tactical doctrine obsolete. The Luftwaffe would have to defend German airspace against bomber formations escorted throughout their entire mission profiles, with no points where bombers would be reliably undefended. The March 4th mission to Berlin had tactical consequences that extended far beyond the immediate damage inflicted on German industry. Luftwaffe fighter commanders could no longer position their forces based on predicted escort turnback points. American fighters might appear anywhere at any time, escorting bombers to any target in Germany. This uncertainty forced German fighters to disperse their strength rather than concentrating at the points where bomber formations would be most vulnerable. Defensive effectiveness declined as fighter groups tried to cover all possible approaches rather than massing at the critical points they had previously relied on. Fighter pilot morale suffered as the implications became clear. German pilots had been told repeatedly that their enemies faced insurmountable limitations. American fighters couldn't reach certain targets. American bomber crews lacked the skill for precision bombing. American resolve would crumble under sustained pressure. Each promise had proven false. First, the bombers arrived in formations that saturated German defenses. Then, precision bombing damaged critical industries despite weather and defensive fire. Now, the fighters escorted bombers throughout entire missions, eliminating the one tactical advantage German defenders had counted on. What other promises would prove false? What other assurances would collapse when tested against reality? The training crisis that Galland had warned about in previous months intensified after Berlin. German fighter losses had been climbing steadily as American escort capabilities expanded. New pilots with inadequate training were being sent into combat against experienced American fighter pilots flying aircraft. With superior performance characteristics, the Berlin mission demonstrated that this trend would only accelerate. American fighters could now appear anywhere in German airspace, meaning every German fighter mission was potentially a combat mission requiring skill and experience that many new pilots simply didn't possess. Lieutenant Werner Schroer, who had encountered P-38's over Leipzig in February, flew missions against escorted bomber formations throughout March and April. His after-action reports documented the tactical evolution forced on Luftwaffe fighters by American escort capabilities. German fighters could no longer wait for optimal attack positions. They had to engage immediately upon contact, regardless of tactical disadvantage, because delaying meant American fighters would reach altitude and position that made attack impossible. The aggressive tactics achieved some success, but at horrific cost. Schroer's Staffel lost 7 pilots in March, 9 in April, and 12 in May. Replacement pilots arrived with progressively less training, survived progressively fewer missions, and achieved progressively fewer victories. By late April 1944, Luftwaffe fighter groups defending against American daylight raids faced a fundamentally changed strategic situation. The P-38 Lightnings demonstrated range to Berlin, meant that no German target was safe from escorted daylight attack. The P-51 Mustang, arriving in growing numbers with even greater range and superior high-altitude performance, made the situation worse. American bombers could strike anywhere in Germany at any time with fighter protection that German interceptors couldn't overcome through superior tactics or pilot skill alone. The mathematics of attrition worked inexorably against German fighter forces. American aircraft production replaced losses within days. American pilot training pipelines produced skilled replacements who arrived at combat units with 400 to 500 hours of flight time. German production struggled to replace losses within weeks. German training produced minimally qualified pilots with 200 hours or less who survived an average of 5 combat missions before being killed or wounded. The Berlin Escort mission of March 4th represented a turning point, not because it destroyed significant industrial capacity or killed large numbers of German defenders, but because it demonstrated to everyone involved that American air power had solved the escort problem that had limited strategic bombing effectiveness for 2 years. The demonstration was undeniable, documented by hundreds of witnesses on both sides, and impossible to dismiss as propaganda or exaggeration. German intelligence had called the P-38's range impossible. German fighter pilots had been told escorts would turn back before reaching central Germany. German defensive doctrine had been built on assumptions that American fighters lacked the fuel capacity for deep penetration missions. All of those assumptions had been proven catastrophically wrong in a single mission that reached the German capital and returned without fuel-related losses. The psychological impact on German leadership was perhaps as significant as the tactical consequences. Göring's authority had been undermined by his repeated insistence that American capabilities were overstated or impossible, when those impossible capabilities manifested over Berlin. His credibility suffered damage that could not be repaired through propaganda or reassurances. Fighter commanders who had trusted intelligence assessments now questioned every estimate and prediction. Pilots who had been told they faced quantitative disadvantages but qualitative superiority now wondered what other comfortable lies they had been told. Adolf Galland, observing the situation from his position as General der Jagdflieger, recognized that the Berlin mission represented validation of warnings he had been making since August 1943. He had tried to tell Göring that American fighters were appearing at ranges intelligence claimed were impossible. He had been ordered to stop making such reports. He had continued documenting the threat anyway, compiling evidence that might eventually force leadership to acknowledge reality. The March 4th mission made denial impossible. American fighters had escorted bombers to Berlin in strength, fought over the target, and returned safely. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, but validation brought no satisfaction. Galland understood that the tactical situation facing Luftwaffe fighter forces had progressed beyond the point where early warning might have made a difference. Even if German leadership had accepted his August 1943 warnings about P-38 range, the industrial and training deficiencies that now crippled the Luftwaffe would still have existed. Germany could not match American aircraft production rates. German pilot training could not match American training standards. German fuel supplies could not sustain the operational tempo required to contest American air superiority effectively. The strategic situation was hopeless, regardless of when leadership acknowledged American fighter capabilities. The summer of 1944 brought the final confirmation of American air superiority over Germany. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy in June, proceeded under complete Allied air dominance. Luftwaffe fighters that might have contested the landings were either destroyed in earlier fighting, grounded by fuel shortages, or held in reserve for defense of Germany itself. The few German aircraft that did appear over the invasion beaches were so outnumbered that many Allied soldiers never saw a single Luftwaffe plane during the entire Normandy campaign. P-38 Lightnings that had demonstrated their range to Berlin in March now ranged across France and Germany at will, escorting bombers, conducting fighter sweeps, and attacking ground targets with the confidence that came from uncontested air superiority. By autumn 1944, the P-38's role as a strategic escort fighter was diminishing not because of any deficiency, but because the war had moved beyond the requirements that made its unique capabilities essential. The P-51 Mustang offered greater range with lower fuel consumption and better high-altitude performance. The P-47 Thunderbolt provided superior ground attack capability with its heavier armament and greater durability. The Lightning continued flying combat missions through the end of the war, particularly in the Pacific Theater, where its twin-engine reliability remained valuable for long over-water flights. But the critical moment when its specific combination of range, speed, and firepower changed strategic calculations had already passed. German intelligence services eventually produced comprehensive assessments of American fighter capabilities that acknowledged the systematic underestimation of P-38 range and performance. These post-action analyses, compiled as the war wound down, documented how German calculations had consistently assumed American aircraft faced the same fuel consumption constraints that limited Luftwaffe fighters. The assumption that similar aircraft must have similar limitations proved catastrophically wrong. American engines were more fuel efficient. American external tanks were larger and more reliable. American operational procedures emphasized fuel conservation and range extension in ways that German forces had not anticipated or matched. The compounding effect of these differences created performance advantages that exceeded German estimates by margins too large to dismiss as statistical error. Technical intelligence officers examining captured P-38s in late 1944 finally understood how the Americans had achieved what German calculations insisted was impossible. The twin Allison engines consumed approximately 140 gallons per hour at cruise settings, not the 160 to 180 gallons German analysts had estimated based on engine displacement and power output. The external drop tanks held 165 gallons each, not the 120 to 140 gallons German intelligence had assumed based on visual estimates. The aircraft's aerodynamic efficiency allowed cruise speeds of 290 miles per hour, while consuming fuel at rates lower than German fighters achieved at slower speeds. Each individual advantage was modest, but their combination produced range capabilities that exceeded German estimates by 200 miles or more. The intelligence failure wasn't a simple matter of bad calculations or incomplete data. It reflected systematic biases in how German analysts approached the problem of estimating enemy capabilities. They projected their own limitations onto American forces, assuming that similar technologies must produce similar results. They dismissed evidence that contradicted their assumptions as propaganda or statistical outliers. They built tactical doctrine on comfortable conclusions rather than uncomfortable possibilities. The result was a fighter defense system optimized for threats that didn't exist while remaining vulnerable to threats intelligence insisted were impossible. Years after the war, historians studying Luftwaffe operations identified the intelligence failure regarding P-38 escort capabilities as symptomatic of broader problems in German military assessment and decision-making. Senior leadership consistently preferred reassuring analyses over accurate ones. Intelligence services tailored their conclusions to match what commanders wanted to hear rather than what evidence suggested was true. Field reports that contradicted established assumptions were dismissed or reinterpreted rather than prompting reassessment of those assumptions. The pattern appeared across multiple theaters and multiple types of operations, but its consequences were particularly clear in the air war over Germany, where American capabilities consistently exceeded what German intelligence predicted was possible. The March 4th Berlin escort mission became a reference point in post-war analysis of strategic bombing effectiveness and fighter escort doctrine. American air power advocates pointed to the mission as proof that strategic bombing could succeed when bomber formations received adequate fighter protection throughout their missions. Critics noted that even with complete escort coverage, bomber losses remained significant, and precision bombing achieved only modest accuracy rates. Both perspectives contained truth. The Berlin mission demonstrated that American fighters could escort bombers anywhere in Germany, solving the range problem that had limited strategic bombing effectiveness. But solving the range problem didn't automatically solve the fundamental challenges of penetrating defended airspace and hitting specific targets with acceptable accuracy and sustainable losses. What remained indisputable was that German intelligence had called the P-38's escort range to Berlin propaganda and impossible, then watched American fighters complete exactly that mission with fuel to spare. The gap between what German analysis predicted and what American forces achieved represented one of the war's most significant intelligence failures, with consequences that shaped air combat operations throughout the final year of the European War. Captain James Howard survived the war and later received the Medal of Honor for actions during an escort mission where his P-38's guns jammed, forcing him to resort to aggressive flying to disrupt German fighter attacks on the bombers he was protecting. His March 4th mission to Berlin wasn't the most dramatic action he flew, but it represented the culmination of technical development, operational planning, and tactical evolution that transformed American fighter escorts from short-range defensive weapons into strategic assets capable of protecting bombers throughout their entire mission profiles. The P-38 Lightning's demonstrated range to Berlin validated years of engineering work, developing external fuel tanks, optimizing fuel consumption, and refining operational procedures that extracted maximum performance from available technology. It validated the pilots who pushed their aircraft to operational limits while maintaining the discipline required to manage fuel consumption precisely enough to reach distant targets and return safely. Most importantly, it invalidated the comfortable assumptions that allowed German intelligence to dismiss American capabilities as impossible, even when their own pilots reported evidence to the contrary. The cost of that dismissal was measured in lost battles, failed defenses, and a strategic air campaign that proceeded with diminishing interference from German fighters who had been promised advantages that never materialized. The wreckage of German air defenses in late 1944 told a story of systematic failure to adapt to enemy capabilities that exceeded predictions. The P-38's over Berlin were physical evidence that American aircraft technology, industrial capacity, and operational competence had achieved what German analysis declared impossible. No amount of German pilot skill or tactical innovation could overcome the fundamental reality that American forces had solved problems German forces couldn't match. The escort fighters reached Berlin with fuel in their tanks and confidence in their capabilities. The defenders who met them there did so, knowing that every assumption they had relied on was false and that the war they were fighting was not the war they had been told to expect. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.